Good afternoon, YouTube. What's going on? It's Pastor Matt again, back for another daily dose of defense. Now, after talking about the crucifixion, the next part that we need to understand is that Jesus' disciples believed he had risen from the dead. And that lends itself to the understanding of what we're going to go through as we talk about the resurrection. But the fact is that the disciples believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. That's 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. Now, what Paul is talking about here is that the disciples, they all had experiences with the risen Jesus. They saw Jesus in the flesh after his crucifixion, after he had been put in the tomb. They met up with him in one way or another. Now, the question isn't whether he really did rise from the dead, it's whether his disciples believed he had risen from the dead. History tells us that his disciples did believe that he rose from the dead. As we look at the martyrdom of each of the disciples, we see that they had this profound belief that Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, we can say, oh, but people die for what they believe all the time. And that's true. But these guys, they were in a unique situation. They knew whether what they believed was true or not. They didn't merely believe it, they knew that it was true. That's in direct opposition to somebody who does something in the name of Allah today. They don't know any of this to be true. They believe it. The disciples, they had this ability to know whether Jesus had risen from the dead. And the fact that they weren't ever willing to ignore his resurrection, ignore his appearing to them, and ignore his commands, even after he had died, shows that the disciples knew Jesus had risen from the dead. Just talk about a few of them. If we look at the apostles, right, Peter, we understand that he was martyred in 66 AD under Emperor Nero. He did ask, as legend tells, he did ask to be crucified upside down, saying that it is not fitting for me to die as my Lord did. Andrew, he went to the land of man-eaters in what is now Russia. And they claim that he was the first to bring the gospel to the land there. Then he came back to Asia Minor, and in Greece he was crucified. Thomas, he went to Syria, and it said that he was pierced by soldiers' spears in Syria. Philip was probably in Carthage in North Africa, and then later in Asia Minor, he was arrested and cruelly put to death in Asia Minor. Matthew was stabbed to death in Ethiopia. Bartholomew, there are several accounts as to how Bartholomew died. Simon the Zealot was killed after refusing to sacrifice to the sun god. Matthias was burned to death in Syria. John is an interesting fellow. John was not martyred. John lived out to the ripe old age. He wrote the Gospel of John somewhere around 90 to 95 AD. Shortly followed after, while he was exiled on the island of Patmos, he would write the book of the Revelation. So the disciples were willing to do this because they had seen a risen Jesus. That's what we see in Paul's creed that he puts out, is that these disciples had seen a risen Jesus. They knew he was alive. There was no doubt in their minds. but Paul also says that there were 500 at one time who had seen the risen Jesus. So some say that they had hallucinated. But hallucinations don't happen in mass groups in that way. If you look at the writings of psychologists and psychiatrists, that's just not how a hallucination works. A hallucination is an individualistic thing that happens. The same can be said of delusions, which some people says that these 500 believers had. Some say that Jesus never died and this was Jesus coming back to see them. But we can tell throughout history that that's just not true, right? Who's going to follow a beaten, bruised, and nearly dead Messiah figure and claim that he came back to life? They talk about the resurrection as though it's a bodily resurrection. So that means that his body was different. It was new. It was healed. So they wouldn't have been okay with following a guy who had been beaten nearly to death. And the Romans would not have allowed a living man to get off the cross. That's not the way it worked. But some say that it was a conspiracy. But that comes back to, would the disciples be willing to die for something they knew to be a lie? And history tells us that no. Somebody is going to say, whoa, wait a second. I didn't really mean that Jesus rose again. But none of them did. Right? The creed that Paul is quoting here, just the creedal portion, comes from about 1 to 3 years after the crucifixion. We're talking the next Easter. They've got this creed and are reciting it. Right? So there's no time for legend to evolve. And we can see that not just from Christian writers about it, but also from skeptical writers about the resurrection. Robert Funk, founder of the Jesus Seminar, Gerd Ludemann, an atheist scholar, and Bart Ehrman, another scholar who's an atheist. He actually calls himself an agnostic, bordering on atheism. They concede the early development of this creed. So, no later than 2 to 3 years. Bart Ehrman actually puts it at 18 months. So we're not talking this was formed a long time after. No, we're talking this is short form. So this isn't legend. It's not a hallucination. And it's not a delusion. These men and women were willing to die for what they knew. And that is that Jesus was resurrected. This has been a Daily Dose of Defense. Thank you, and God bless.